It was one of those winters that didn't announce itself loudly. No storms on the news, no dramatic warnings, just a quiet, biting cold that crept into bones, into breath, into places people forgot existed. The kind of cold that doesn't scream, it waits. On the corner of Maple Street, where the city's tallest glass buildings reflected success and warmth, there was a small community outreach van parked near the sidewalk. It wasn't new. Its white paint had faded, the logo slightly peeling at the edges. But inside, it carried something far more valuable than appearances. It carried time, patience, and quiet kindness. Every Thursday evening, volunteers parked there to hand out food, hot drinks, and blankets to anyone who needed them. Nothing extraordinary. No cameras, no speeches, no applause. Just people helping people. That night, the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The wind slipped between coats and scarves like it had memorized every weakness. Steam rose from cups of soup, fogging the air with brief warmth before disappearing. Most people approached the van quickly, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, hands trembling slightly from the cold. Some asked for soup, some asked for coffee, some asked for nothing at all. And then he appeared. He didn't rush forward like the others. He didn't stand back either. He simply waited. A man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, hard to tell because life had aged him unevenly. His coat was thin, far too thin for the weather, and patched in places where the fabric had worn down. His shoes were clean but old, soles worn flat from miles of walking that had nowhere specific to go. His hands were bare, red, crocked, holding nothing. He stood a few steps away from the van, watching. Not the food, not the volunteers. He watched the blankets. They were stocked neatly inside a plastic bin, thick, donated blankets in mismatched colors, some floral, some plain, some faded with age but still warm. The man swallowed. When one of the volunteers finally noticed him and smiled, he took a hesitant step forward. "Evening," the volunteer said gently. The man nodded. His voice, when it came, was quiet, practiced in being quiet. "Excuse me," he said. He didn't explain further. He didn't complain about the cold. He didn't say he was homeless. He didn't say he hadn't slept properly in weeks. He didn't say his hands shook at night because the cold made old injuries ache. He just asked for a warm blanket.
The volunteer, a woman in her early 30s, wearing a thick jacket and a knitted hat, reached instinctively toward the bin. But something made her pause. Not suspicion, something else. She noticed how carefully he stood, how he didn't step too close, how his eyes flicked briefly toward the ground, as if he didn't want to take more than what was offered, as if asking alone already felt like too much. "Of course," she said. She bent to lift a blanket, and that's when she noticed his hands. They weren't just cold. They were damaged. Small scars ran across his knuckles. One finger didn't straighten fully. The skin looked tight, stretched thin over bone, as if warmth had been a stranger for a very long time. The volunteer hesitated, not because she didn't want to help, but because something about this man didn't fit the pattern she'd grown used to. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't desperate in the way people often are when survival pushes them to the edge. He was contained, as if life had taught him to fold himself smaller. She handed him the blanket. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. "Thank you," he said. And then, unexpectedly, he stopped. He didn't leave. He didn't turn away. He looked at the blanket, then back at the volunteer. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Would it be all right if I stayed here for just a minute? I don't need anything else." The volunteer blinked. "Of course," she replied. He nodded again. Carefully, slowly, he wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, not tightly, not greedily, just enough to let the warmth settle. When it did, his shoulders dropped slightly, as if he'd been carrying something heavier than cold. He closed his eyes, just for a second. And in that second, something shifted. The volunteer felt it before she understood it. This wasn't about warmth alone. This was about relief, about the moment when the body realizes it might be allowed to rest. Around them, the city kept moving. Cars passed, lights changed, People walked by without looking. But in that small pocket of time, something deeply human unfolded. The man exhaled, a slow, controlled breath. And when he opened his eyes again, they were glassy. Not crying, just overwhelmed. "I haven't felt this warm in a while," he said, almost to himself. The volunteer smiled softly. He nodded. Then, as if catching himself, he straightened. "I'll move along now," he said quickly. He paused. "Nearby," he repeated, choosing the word carefully.
She recognized that pause. Volunteers learned to hear what wasn't said. He looked at her, really looked this time. There was gratitude there, but also something else, something like hesitation, as if accepting kindness was harder than enduring cold. "I appreciate that," he said. And then he walked away, blanket folded neatly around him like something precious. The volunteer watched him go. She told herself she'd done her part, that this was how these nights went. But something tugged at her. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was how carefully he'd asked. Maybe it was how he'd thanked her twice. Maybe it was the way he hadn't asked for food or money or anything else, just warmth. "Yes," she replied automatically, but her eyes drifted back toward the sidewalk. The man had stopped a short distance away. He hadn't gone far. He was standing under a streetlight now, looking down at the blanket again. His fingers traced the edge slowly, as if memorizing its texture. Then he sat down on a low concrete ledge, careful not to dirty it. He wrapped the blanket tighter, and then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic one, just a small, private smile that carried years inside it. The volunteer felt her chest tighten. She had handed out dozens of blankets before, hundreds maybe, but she had never seen someone react like that. It wasn't relief alone, it was recognition. As if the blanket wasn't just warmth, it was proof that someone still saw him. The volunteer didn't know it yet, but this small moment, this ordinary exchange on a cold Thursday night, was about to change everything she believed about helping others. Because the man with the worn coat and quiet voice was carrying a story far heavier than the blanket on his shoulders. And by the end of the night, it wouldn't just be him who would leave changed. The volunteer tried to focus on the next person in line. A woman asked for soup. A teenager asked for gloves. A man joked lightly about the cold, trying to pretend it wasn't bothering him. But her attention kept hefting back to the streetlight. The man with the blanket hadn't moved. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't begging. He wasn't pacing nervously. He just sat there, still, composed, as if the world had finally given him permission to pause. That image stayed with her longer than it should have. She had volunteered here for nearly 2 years. She'd learned early on that emotional distance was necessary.
If you carried every story home with you, you wouldn't last a month. But this was different, because there was nothing dramatic about him. No loud suffering, no visible crisis, just quiet endurance. And that, somehow, felt heavier. As the line thinned, the volunteer found herself glancing toward him again. He adjusted the blanket carefully, making sure it didn't drag on the ground. Even in need, he carried himself with a strange sense of dignity. She wondered, not for the first time, how someone ends up like this. Not in a vague philosophical way, but in a very specific human way. What chain of moments leads a man to measure his needs so carefully that he apologizes for warmth? A few minutes later, her fellow volunteer nudged her gently. He asked again, quieter this time. She nodded. "Yeah." He followed her gaze. She hesitated, then nodded again. "Something about him," she said. Her colleague shrugged gently. That was true, but it didn't answer the question pressing against her thoughts. What was his story, and why did it feel unfinished? Across the street, the man shifted slightly as a gust of wind cut through the space between buildings. He pulled the blanket closer, but his movements were slow, deliberate, like someone conserving energy. He wasn't looking for attention. If anything, he seemed intent on disappearing into the background. A couple walked past him, laughing, arms linked. They didn't glance his way. A delivery driver jogged by, phone pressed to his ear.
Life flowed around him as if he were part of the sidewalk. And maybe that's what unsettled the volunteer most. Not that he was ignored, but that he expected to be. After another 10 minutes, she made a decision. It wasn't in the volunteer handbook. It wasn't something she'd planned, but it felt necessary. She picked up a fresh cup of soup, snapped the lid on tightly, and walked toward him. Not fast, not dramatically, just human. When he noticed her approaching, he stiffened slightly, as if bracing himself. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "You're not in trouble," she said quickly, smiling. "I just wanted to offer this." She held out the cup. He looked at it, then at her, then back at the cup again. "I didn't ask for food," he said softly. "I know," I replied, "but it's cold." For a moment, he didn't move. This was the first sign of conflict, not between people, but inside him. Accepting help was clearly not easy. Finally, he reached out. "Thank you," he said again. She sat down on the opposite end of the concrete ledge, leaving space between them. Not too close, not too far. They sat in silence for a few seconds, steam rising between them. "You do okay?" she asked gently. He nodded.
The past tense hung in the air. "You don't have to answer anything you don't want to," she added quickly. He considered that, then surprised her by speaking anyway. "I worked 3 blocks from here," he said. Her curiosity sharpened, but she didn't interrupt. "I used to walk this street every morning," he continued. "Same coffee shop, same crossing light." His eyes drifted toward the buildings. "And what did you do?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maintenance, building systems." Her breath caught slightly, an irony she wasn't sure he noticed. "You fixed heaters," she said. "Yes," he replied. He took a sip of soup, hands steadier now. The volunteer felt something shift again. A man who once kept others warm now sat wrapped in donated fabric, grateful for borrowed heat. Life had a cruel sense of symmetry sometimes. "Why?" she asked, then immediately regretted how blunt it sounded. But he didn't seem offended. "Life," he said simply. "Why?" He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. Instead, she asked something safer. "Do you have a place now?" He nodded again, slower this time. "There's a place," he said. "Not ideal." She sensed another careful choice of words. "Safer than the street?" she asked. He hesitated. "Safer than the street?" he replied. That answer stayed with her, because it wasn't reassurance, it was compromise. As the hour wore on, the outreach van began packing up. Volunteers folded tables, stacked empty containers, counted remaining supplies. The night was nearly over. The volunteer stood and brushed her gloves together. "We're heading out soon," she said. He nodded, "Of course." She gestured toward the blanket. "Can I leave it here?" His eyes went slightly. "I assumed so," she added quickly. Something passed across his face then, surprise, followed by something dangerously close to emotion. "I'll take good care of it," he said. "I believe you," she replied. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Do you come out here?"
Because the question that had settled between them, "Why do we help?" was about to be answered in a way neither of them expected. And the man who asked for nothing more than warmth was carrying a truth that would soon turn a simple act of kindness into something unforgettable. The volunteer didn't expect to see him again. Most people who came through the outreach van appeared once, maybe twice, and then disappeared back into the invisible pathways of the city. Faces blended together. Stories remained unfinished. But 3 nights later, as the sun sank behind the buildings and the cold returned like a habit, she saw a familiar figure near the same streetlight. He stood exactly where he had before. Same worn coat, same careful posture, and the blanket, folded neatly over his arm. Something about that stopped her in her tracks. Most people wrapped the blankets around themselves immediately, used them until they frayed, lost them, traded them. He had kept it intact. When he noticed her, he nodded, a small, respectful greeting. Not expectation, not entitlement, just recognition. "You're back," she said, surprised. "So are you," he replied with a faint smile. She laughed softly. They fell into conversation more easily this time. Familiarity had softened the edges. She asked.
"It's warmer than it looks," he said. He considered his answer. She sat beside him again, the space between them slightly smaller now. She asked. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked up at the buildings, at windows glowing with evening light. "Heat," he said finally. "Routine." That last one lingered. She felt an unexpected pull to ask more, not as a volunteer, but as a person. She asked. His jaw tightened subtly. "Waking up with a purpose," he said. She nodded. "Yes," he agreed quietly. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't awkward this time. It felt shared. Over the next few weeks, their conversations continued. Not every night, not on a schedule, but often enough that it began to feel intentional. She learned small things about him, nothing dramatic, just fragments. His name was Daniel. He liked black coffee, no sugar. He once enjoyed fixing things that others considered beyond repair. "I liked problems," he admitted one evening. "People aren't like that," she said. He smiled. No. He asked about her too, why she volunteered, what she did during the day.
Whether she ever got tired of helping people who might never change their circumstances. "Sometimes," she admitted. He nodded. That answer stayed with her. One evening, as the wind picked up and the city quieted earlier than usual, she noticed something different about him. He looked strained. Not physically, emotionally. She asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "I was asked to move on from the shelter tonight," he said. Her heart dropped. "Too many people," he replied. She clenched her jaw. "It's all right," he said quickly. That sentence bothered her, because it suggested a depth of hardship he still hadn't shared. "Where?" she asked. "There's an old service corridor under the transit bridge," he said. "It stays dry." She stared at him. He gave a humorless smile. That night, she went home carrying more than the cold. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about how composed he was, how carefully he rationed hope, and about something else, something she hadn't dared to consider before. What if he didn't just need help? What if he had once been the helper? The realization came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday morning, weeks later. She was walking past an older office building, one scheduled for renovation, when she noticed a plaque near the entrance. Building Systems Modernization, Lead Technician, D. The name caught her breath. Daniel Harper. Her pulse quickened. It couldn't be. Had it? She stood there longer than she meant to, staring at the engraved letters. That building was 3 blocks from the outreach van. 3 blocks from where Daniel now wrapped himself in donated warmth. That night, she found him again. "Daniel." He froze. Just for a second. Then slowly nodded. "Yes," he said. Her voice softened. He exhaled. "I was." She asked gently. This time, the pause was longer. "I got sick," he said. Not all at once. He stared at his hands. "I'd missed work. Then I'd missed more. The company replaced me. I told myself I'd catch up." He swallowed. She listened, heart aching. "My savings went faster than I expected," he continued. "Then my apartment." He looked up at her. "You're still useful." She felt tears sting her eyes. "You're still useful." He smiled sadly. That night, something shifted between them. The story was no longer abstract. It was personal. And for the first time, she understood that Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was grieving. Grieving the man he used to be. The respect. The routine. The identity.
And the warmth he once provided to others. She went home that night knowing something important. This wasn't just a story about kindness. It was a story about reversal. And she had a feeling the ending hadn't yet been written. After learning the truth about Daniel, the volunteer couldn't return to her routine the same way. Handing out soup, offering smiles, packing up and going home. It all felt incomplete. Because now she didn't just see faces. She saw futures that had been interrupted. And Daniel's story sat with her more heavily than she wanted to admit. Not because it was tragic, but because it was frighteningly ordinary. A man who worked, who contributed, who fixed things. And then one illness, one delay, one slow unraveling, and suddenly he was on the other side of kindness instead of offering it. She began to notice small things she hadn't before. How Daniel always arrived early, never late. How he helped fold tables without being asked. How he quietly warned other people when the temperature dropped suddenly. "You should wrap that tighter," he'd say to someone new. He wasn't just receiving help. He was protecting others with what he knew. One evening, as the volunteers struggled with a malfunctioning heater inside the van, Daniel watched from a distance. Finally, he spoke. The volunteers exchanged looks. One asked. Daniel nodded. They stepped aside. Daniel leaned in, slow, careful, respectful of boundaries. He listened to the heater, adjusted a valve, repositioned a vent. Within minutes, warm air flowed steadily again. The volunteers stared. "That's impressive," someone said. Daniel shrugged. The volunteer felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about help anymore. This was about restoring dignity. From that night on, Daniel was no longer just a visitor. He became part of the rhythm, not officially, not formally, but naturally. He helped set up chairs. He checked wind directions. He reminded people to drink something warm before leaving. And slowly, people began to look at him differently, not as someone in need, but as someone capable. One night, a young man approached Daniel directly. "Hey," he said. Daniel hesitated. "My building's radiator barely works." Daniel listened carefully, asked a few questions, then offered practical advice, simple things that could make a difference. The young man's shoulders relaxed. "Thanks," he said. Daniel smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. The volunteer watched all of this quietly. She realized something important. Helping Daniel didn't mean saving him. It meant reminding him who he already was. Still, the practical reality remained. Cold nights, unstable shelter, no steady income. Kindness alone wouldn't solve those things. So she began to act, carefully, respectfully. She contacted a local job assistance center, a community repair initiative, an organization that helped skilled workers re-enter the workforce. She didn't promise Daniel anything. She just gathered options. One evening, she sat beside him again. "What do you think?" she asked. He tensed slightly. "Work," she said gently. "Not tomorrow, not pressure." He stared at the blanket in his hands. "I don't want charity," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. She explained the programs, the support, the steps. Daniel listened. "I'm older than most of the people they help," he said. "Experience isn't a weakness," she replied. He didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. The turning point came unexpectedly. A brutal cold front moved in overnight, colder than anyone had anticipated. The outreach van struggled to keep up. Supplies ran low. Tensions rose. And that night, someone collapsed from the cold before reaching the van. Nothing graphic, nothing sensational, just the quiet reality of exposure. Daniel was the first to respond. He coordinated others, used the blankets efficiently, redirected wind exposure. His voice was steady, clear, authoritative. By the time emergency services arrived, the situation was under control. "No," Daniel shook his head. "No." But the truth was undeniable. He had stepped into leadership without hesitation. That night, as they packed up, the volunteer looked at Daniel and realized something powerful. He wasn't broken. He had just been paused. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Small things. Daniel attended an intake meeting. He filled out paperwork with trembling hands. He doubted himself openly. "Will he?" he asked. The volunteer answered honestly, "Yes." Slowly, opportunities opened. Not miracles, just steps.
A part-time maintenance role at a community center, temporary housing support, a routine. The first night Daniel didn't need the blanket, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "I think someone else might need this more now," he said. The volunteer's eyes filled. "You can keep it," she said. He shook his head gently. She understood. And yet, the story wasn't finished, because just when Daniel began to rebuild, something unexpected surfaced. A truth that would redefine the meaning of that first night. A revelation that would leave everyone, volunteers, strangers, and viewers in tears. The night Daniel returned the blanket should have felt like an ending, but it wasn't. It was a beginning disguised as closure. The volunteer held the folded blanket in her hands long after he walked away. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Warmth given, warmth received, warmth passed on. She placed it back into the bin carefully, and then she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A stitched name on the corner of the fabric, faded, almost invisible, but still there. Just one letter. She frowned slightly. It didn't mean anything to her, yet. Weeks passed. Daniel's life continued to stabilize, slowly but steadily. He worked mornings at the community center now. Not glamorous work, fixing doors, checking boilers, adjusting thermostats, but honest, needed work. He walked differently, straighter, lighter. He still visited the outreach van occasionally, but not as someone in need, as someone who belonged. One evening, as they packed up supplies together, he paused. "There's something I never told you," he said. She looked at him. "I know," he replied. They sat on the familiar ledge again, the place where everything had started. She waited. "It was the first night I'd gone 3 days without speaking to anyone," he continued. "Not a cashier, not a shelter worker." Her chest tightened. "I know," he nodded. "I know," she swallowed hard. "I almost didn't stop that night," she admitted. He smiled gently. The twist came quietly, not with drama, not with shock, but with truth. One afternoon, the volunteer received a call from the community center director. "We had someone come by today," he said. "An older woman." Her breath caught. "Who is it?" They met the woman the following evening. She was in her late 70s, neatly dressed, walking with a cane. Her eyes were sharp, alert. When she saw Daniel, she stopped.
"You," she said. Daniel froze. "I hoped it was you," she continued, voice trembling slightly. Daniel's eyes widened. "Mrs.?" She nodded. "You stayed late that night," she said. Daniel swallowed. "My husband was very sick then," she continued. "He didn't survive much longer." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. "I never forgot that," she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out something folded. A blanket. Old, worn, carefully kept. "I donated this years ago," she said, "in my husband's memory." She unfolded the corner. The volunteer's breath caught. "This blanket, Mrs.?" Daniel stared at it, hands shaking. Silence fell around them. Not empty, full. The volunteer felt tears spill freely now, because the truth was clear. The warmth Daniel once gave to others had found its way back to him, not by chance, but by kindness completing a circle. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought my life was over," he said. Mrs. Holloway smiled. The volunteer looked at Daniel then, not as someone she'd helped, but as someone who had always been part of something larger. "You didn't just fix heaters," she said. "You fixed people's nights." Daniel exhaled, something unclenching inside him. That winter ended quietly. No headlines, no viral moment, just lives continuing. Daniel remained at the community center, eventually full-time. He trained younger workers, passed on knowledge. The volunteer continued showing up, wiser now, softer, more patient. And the blanket? It stayed with the outreach van, still folded, still ready, still moving from one set of shoulders to another. Because sometimes the smallest requests carry the largest stories. A warm blanket, a moment of recognition, a human connection. And sometimes the kindness you offer the world finds its way back to you, right when you need it most. The story isn't about charity. It's about continuity, about how no act of care is ever wasted, about how dignity survives even the coldest seasons, and about how seeing someone, truly seeing them, can change the direction of a life.